book, Silver Treasures of the Land of Sheba. Marjorie Ransom lived twice in Yemen in 1966 and 1975 as a U.S. diplomat with a 30-year career in the Arab world. Speaking fluent Arabic, she researched traditional silver throughout her career. And in 2005, with the help of the American Institute for Yemeni Studies, she had a research grant, she spent a year in Yemen, traveling to the most remote areas, researching jewelry and costumes. Her genuine love of the people and the subject, along with her charm, opened closed doors that made this first in-depth study of Yemeni silver in a changing world possible. Here is, I'm proud to say, my friend, Marjorie Ransom.
I want to thank Dagmar and the Jerusalem Fund for allowing me to return to the podium once more here in the Jerusalem Fund. And I want to thank all my friends from all different parts of my life for coming today. It's a lovely, lovely reunion. I grew up in a small village in northern New York, population 834. There were more cows than people. I believe that I acquired there an interest in people that served me well in my diplomatic career, and was especially helpful when I began my research into Yemeni life. I had worked in Yemen as a diplomat twice, but it was with some trepidation and self-doubt that I flew to Yemen to immerse myself in a conservative society, asking silver dealers, silversmiths, and women questions about their beautiful handicraft. I had a great advantage in being a woman of some years. I could travel with men and no one batted an eyelash. I had always dressed conservatively in the Middle East, but Yemenis carry this a bit further. I started out wearing outfits that made me look like a South Asian. They used to look at me and ask if I were, this isn't working. Well, they used to look at me and ask if I were Moroccan. It was only when my book advisor for the South, in the southern part of the country, told me that I had to dress like this before he would enable me to enter homes that I'd made myself go out and buy these clothes. When I returned to my apartment in Sana'a, up there on the 4th floor, I wore it on my first walk through the market where I lived. Men called out to me. They always do this, and as a woman, you just look straight ahead and keep moving. They said, "Look at her. She's dressed like us. She likes us." I can't tell you how much more acceptable I was in that black dress. It opened doors and broke down barriers. As you look at my pictures today, look carefully at the architecture, so different and so special in the north and the south. The quality and quantity of the extraordinary terraces, the costumes, the intricacy of the jewelry, and the amazing variety of the styles. And remember that Yemen is a poor country, yet the people work so hard to surround themselves with beauty. In Jewelry Empowering Women, a Yemeni story, I give you a tale of exotic jewelry and costumes worn by Bedouin and tribal women. It wasn't city women who owned most of these treasures. I'll show you the few instances when you are looking at jewelry worn by the urban elite. Hundreds of silversmiths worked throughout the mountains, the oases, and the seacoasts to make pieces to fit the special needs of their customers. The amount of jewelry in that period that I cover, 1900 to 1970, was extraordinary. And I have population figures here. In 1900, there were 2,300,000 Yemenis. And in 1970, there were 6,252,000,000 Yemenis, much different than today. A poor Bedouin woman on the southern coast of Yemen told me that when she married, she had 11 kilos or 22 pounds of silver jewelry. The bride had to have new jewelry when she married, so most pieces were not passed down. Thus, the jewelry you will see was made in the 20th century. Women began to move from gold to silver in the 1960s. And this explains why so many old pieces showed up in the silver market during my period of research. My book is based on interviews I conducted in Arabic, and for your convenience, I have given you a map to use if you want to follow my peregrinations. And for those who really know about silver jewelry, I've given you jewelry terms transliterated from Arabic on the back. You all know where Yemen is, on the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. I traveled north of Sana'a as far as they would let me go, to about here, to Reda. That was it. But I then went all down the coast. I went all through the mountains. I was in Sheba, Sayun. Sheher down here on the coast was an important center of silversmiths. And I went east to Seyhut in Mahra. The farthest east jewelry was made. North Yemen was ruled by imams from the 12th century. And they call this South Yemen. It's really east. It was ruled by the British from the 1830s. And the jewelry reflects these geographic differences. The country was united only in 1990. Why was jewelry so important in Yemeni society? First and foremost, it played a key role in the marriage contract drawn up to allow the groom to marry the bride. And jewelry was a major part of the bride price, the mahr that was paid. And it became, upon marriage, the jewelry became the property of the bride. According to Islamic law, it was hers to dispose of. That brought her power. It also gave women a certain identity. It gave them amuletic protection, and finally, beauty and pleasure. This is the accumulation of jewelry owned by a poor Bedouin woman on the southern coast of the Hadramaut. She wouldn't pose herself for a photograph, but she allowed her young daughter to dress up in as much as she could get on. This is Fatima. She lives in a mud hut outside of Zabid, down on the Red Sea coast. After she married, she decided that she wanted to use her jewelry to make a religious pilgrimage to Mecca. And so she sold it all, but this one piece that she couldn't bear to part with. She would only let me interview her after she had extracted a promise that I would not try to buy it. It was hard, believe me. Now, these bracelets, and the bracelets I'm wearing, are from Sada, up on the border with Saudi Arabia. They specialized in granulation, very intricate granulation, and their bracelets were recognized all over the northern mountains as coming from Sada. This unique piece, it's gilded silver. It was worn only by a married woman in Sayun, the largest city in the Hadramaut. And this piece, also in the Hadramaut, it was worn in Wadi Duan, that famous valley. A woman wore it down one side of her head, and that indicated that she was a married woman. Now, I promised to show you jewelry worn by the elite. These two pieces, probably both made by Yusuf el-Abyad, were worn by the Imamic family in Sana'a and also rich merchants' families. You'll notice that they're very light. The value was not in the metal, but instead in the work, unlike the other pieces. This headpiece, worn in Sayun, has a number of things that give protection to the wearer. The beads, which in this case are plastic, but were often coral, that would protect the wearer. They would give the wearer good health and also protect against bleeding. She also has in her headdress two different amuletic shapes, the cylindrical shape and the rectangular shape. Both of these originally would have contained a prayer from a holy man or a verse from the Quran, but eventually the shapes took on the amuletic power and they no longer opened. Finally, she has a lot of dangles at the bottom that make a lot of noise. Women in the Hadramaut are especially well known for loving to dance, so all their jewelry makes a lot of noise. These two bracelets were made in Sana. They're both gilded silver. The one on the left was worn only by a Jewish bride. The round shape stands for a woman's breast, indicating fertility, and this is the shape of a tomb. So the bracelet symbolizes life and death. Now this bracelet, again a filigree, was made throughout the northern mountains, really. It has a motif. It's the whale here and the flower. The whale and the flower, the hutwa zuhra. And we will see that again and again in northern jewelry. Now these are a variety of amulets worn in Wadi Duan, that famous valley in the Hadramaut. The one on the left has an animal's tooth and a red stone, and they placed it on a child to protect against toothache. Now this necklace, which is still made today, it has a wonderful bright red Yemeni agate. It's specifically to prevent nosebleed. I don't know why they had a lot of nosebleeds, but they must have. This necklace was worn by a married woman. It has the crescent shape and the sun, both protective. This again is the cylindrical shape, and these two amulets have a slogan on them, "Oh, protect me, oh my protector." Finally, the jewelry brought her much beauty and pleasure. These two pieces were made by a Jewish community that lived in Haban. That's the furthest east Jews lived in Yemen that I know of. And you see those red stones. They made jewelry for the Bedouin of the Marib and Jauf, and they loved to have a lot of red in their jewelry, again, protective against bleeding. These pieces are from a small community of silversmiths in Ib, very different and very exciting. These rings, gilded silver and ungilded, were worn throughout the northern Hadramaut between Tarim and Sayun. Now, where did all the silver come from? Did Yemen have mines of silver? It didn't. It did before the advent of Islam, but not afterwards. So they got the silver in the shape of Maria Theresa thalers. Now, how did that happen? Well, in the early 18th century, Yemen was exporting a lot of coffee, indigo, incense, and spices to Europe, and in return, they got Maria Theresa thalers. And when I was posted in Yemen in 1966, the embassy was still paying its Foreign Service nationals in Maria Theresa thalers. They brought them in huge bags. So these coins were all melted down to make jewelry, but they were also included in the jewelry itself to indicate prosperity and the good life. That is a belt from Marib. It's Maria Theresa thalers mounted on rough leather. Now, if, as it says here, the thaler was 83% silver, and most of the Yemeni jewelry is of 83% silver. But sometimes they wanted something with a higher silver content, so they would turn to the Saudi rial, which would give them sterling silver, or 93%. Now, the tradition of making jewelry goes back to the time of Queen of Sheba. Especially, there are three main techniques, especially in the northern jewelry: filigree, granulation, and loop and loop chain. Here you have loop and loop chain, and here you have granulation. The filigree came later. Now we start our tour of jewelry with Sana'a, certainly the most important center, and with my favorite silver dealer, Hajj Ali Caboose. Now this was Hajj Ali Caboose's Fibber McGee closet full of jewelry. Every time I went to see Hajj Ali, I would always start out the same way. Oh, Hajj Ali, let me help you organize your shop so you know what you have and so I can better see what you have. And I always got that smile in response. Now this gives you a quick look at the architecture in Sana'a, which goes back to the time of the Himyarites, which dates from before the Common Era. They are buildings built of hand-chipped stone and mud brick and decorated in a very beautiful way with Gus, and you'll have colored glass panes in the windows on the upper stories. And this woman, these two women in fact, are wearing an outfit that was worn in Sana'a and the environs and is worn to this day. She's wearing an outer covering that's made in India and a veil that was tie-dyed in Sana'a. And these are the eye shapes to repel the evil eye. Now in Sana'a, there were two important Jewish silversmith families. Actually, there were more than two, but they are remembered because certain types of jewelry are named after them. This belt is signed by Harun Balsani. He specialized in filigree. And there you see that motif I mentioned earlier, the whale and the zuhra, the flower. And this piece is signed by Yahya Badihi. It's a small piece, but he specialized in this kind of granulation. So pieces that had intricate filigree were called Balsani work, and it was a great way for the dealers to augment the value of the piece they were selling. And pieces with granulation were called a Badihi. But these three pieces were made by a silversmith named Yahya Saleh, and they were all for the bride. He specialized in jewelry that the bride would wear. This is a Jewish bride. She was photographed in the late 1930s. I don't think she could get much more on. She has a gilded silver kumbai headdress. These are probably artificial flowers that she adorned herself with. She is wearing, it's hard to see them, but she is wearing the same herbs that we will see later in a picture of a Muslim bride. Basil and rue. Now she had to have lots of these extraordinary beads. They came in two types. These were called barley beads. Those are shapes resemble a barley seed. And these were called granulated beads. And each piece was signed by the maker. Now this is our Muslim bride. We couldn't find a good picture of one, so we dressed one. And we didn't get all the jewelry she would have had in the old days in Sana'a. We couldn't get more on her. She was very petite and she was already really quite burdened. You see here some of the same jewelry pieces, but you'll notice that she wore a lot of amber, which for some reason the Jewish bride didn't. Now that is not amber in the classic sense because amber is soft and it's not, you can't cut it into bead shapes. You have to compress it. These two necklaces are of compressed amber, and it's the highest quality amber bead that you can get. Now we move to Sada. Here is a Muslim woman dressed up for a feast day in all her finery. I was lucky enough to have the two pieces she's wearing. She's wearing this on her head and this piece right here. And this was made by a Sada silversmith bin Mirri. We move west to the high mountains, to Haraz, where the Ismailis live. This is the town of Hajara. It had an important community of silversmiths. They also embroidered the finest costume that I saw in Yemen. And you will notice the deep black of the indigo cloth. The Yemenis had a special technique for dyeing cloth with indigo. They would dye the whole costume a couple of times, and then they would pound additional powdered indigo into the cloth, producing a very shiny, dense color on the fabric. And you'll notice that her leggings also are embroidered in silver thread. This embroidery is couched, which means you make your design, and they were plates of gilded silver. You make your design, and then you go under the fabric to sew it on. This is the jewelry from Haraz. It's quite extraordinary. Here you see the piece that is repeated over here. It's the same necklace, actually. It is called an akt merjan, and an akt has two meanings, really. It identifies this piece of jewelry, but it also is the word for marriage contract. This cylinder shape, called a kitab, it opened, and it would have had a prayer inside, or a verse from the Quran. And here is another one. And then an extraordinary bracelet that dates from the late 19th century. Now we go to mahwit. And in mahwit, we have another use of a term that has two meanings. These necklaces, with the plaque in the middle and several strands, and then the triangular ends and the pendant coming down, they were called lazums. And lazim means adheres to the chest, and it also means essential or necessary. You had to wear that at least on one day of the wedding. Oh, sorry. And I did want to point out these extraordinary terraces, which were built up over many, many, many centuries. And I was told that this canyon is deeper than the Grand Canyon. I can't prove it, but that's what I was told. Now we move out to Marib, which is in the middle of the country, out to the east, a flat area where you have very, how do you say it, very, what's a good adjective to describe a tribesman? Militaristic is a bit strong, but they were never far from their Kalashnikov. And that's Abda. She posed wearing her wedding jewelry, and a lovely old headscarf that would have been made in probably down on the coast in Beit el Faqih. So they did trade back and forth. This is a face mask, and this wonderful piece probably went down her back. I don't have good documentation for that. And these are, one is a Maria Teresa thaler, the other is a Spanish coin, and they would have been worn in the middle of the forehead out in the Marib area. This is Al-Bayda. Al-Bayda is a governorate which, before unity, was on the border with South Yemen, and certain things, of course, crossed the border. They had Jewish silversmiths who then left in Operation Magic Carpet in 1948. And so they were replaced by a wonderful silversmith named Bah Hashwan, which is a large silver-making family in the Hadramaut. He made these pieces, and he made that very unusual headpiece. And I had the opportunity to interview him in Aden, where he lives now. Now we move to a range of mountains that are in the middle of the country. They're just east of that 40-mile strip that runs north-south along the Red Sea, between the Red Sea and the mountains. This is Bora. They were famous for coffee. They were famous for a certain kind of jewelry. And Louise is wearing a bracelet from Burak, which is quite lovely, right there. This is another one of those areas on the mountains near the Red Sea. And you recognize that piece. I'm wearing it. It has the finest granulation of any piece I have. And this necklace is like the bigger akt, but it's called a birth necklace. A woman was given this upon the birth of her first child. Very lovely present. Now, I couldn't get much information before I traveled to the Wasab. It's a remote area. The roads aren't paved. There was no electricity. And I didn't know what I would find before I got there. I went first to Wasab Ali, which is the high Wasab, and they had had Jewish silversmiths who had left, so they had nobody working in silver. They sent me down to Wasab Safel, or the lower Wasab, and there I found a lot of things. These two necklaces are distinctive of Wasabi work. They're those wonderful round beads that they make that have no seam. They're absolutely seamless and they're gorgeous. This piece was made by a Jewish silversmith before he left, and this was made by a Muslim silversmith. Probably he still lives and works in the lower Wasab, although he would be quite on in years. Now, the Wasabis were famous for making what they call mulberry beads. They were used as dividers in large, intricate necklaces. And you'll see that they're made up of many fine granules. They made faux granulation. They pressed a sheet of silver flat over a mold, and they got the granulation design without all the hard work. And they cut it into triangular shapes and created these beautiful beads. You can see the faux granulation up there. You can see it here on those small pieces on these bracelets. And that piece probably was made in Najran, which is now in Saudi Arabia, but by a Wasabi silversmith. Now we move down to the Red Sea coast to Zaydiya. It's a very small town north of Hodeidah, inland. They produce this wonderful cutout work. And the jewelry, several pieces are signed, and the signature you usually see is Bland. There are no more Blands living. Bland is a strange name. It's not a typically Arab name. He could have been Indian, we don't know. There were a lot of Indians living in Yemen. Today there were about 6,000. So don't know, but there's a story in my book about a Jambiya with this wonderful work. This is a bead. Again, it's down on the Red Sea coast. That's a bridal dress. The largest and most well-known jewelry family in Zabid was named Rafa, and the name is there on that bracelet. I had purchased these bracelets. They're very light, hollow, incised. I wasn't sure they were Yemeni. I hadn't seen anything like them before. So I took them when I was calling on Muhammad Yami. He was my informant in Zabid. He introduced me to Muhammad Rafa, who was very excited. He said these bracelets were made by his grandfather. I thought, wow, that's good documentation. Now we have moved to South Yemen, which is off in the east. I have to show you Sheba, which is a skyscraper city. They're mud buildings, 8 and 9 stories high, some of them 300 years old. It's the only city like it that I know of. It's most unusual to have a city built out in a flat area that's hard to defend, but there it is. They were more famous for their woodworking, and they got their silver from Sayun. This is what a Bedouin bride would have worn in the Sayun area of the Hadramaut. She had to wear this crescent-shaped necklace. That is a hyena bone, which was very protective. And this glorious belt that, oh my goodness, you can imagine how much noise that makes. That was made by the grandfather of my consultant for the southern part of the book. Now we are again in that magical valley, Wadi Duan, which is famous for its honey. The honey can go for as much as $80 for a kilo of honey, 2 pounds. The nectar came from these trees, and the valley is full of them. They were famous also for their mud architecture, which was often painted. And the men who built these beautiful buildings, for the most part, live in Saudi Arabia and make their millions and then travel back and forth. We visited a silversmith in Hajarain in the Wadi, And he was showing this extraordinary belt made for a bride. It weighed about 14 pounds. And I exclaimed over the size, and he said, "Oh, it's nothing. If I had a bride with real size, I would make one that weighed about 10 kilos, 22 pounds." These are other pieces worn in that wadi. You notice, again, the eye motif on these bracelets. This identified a woman as a married. This would be a bridal necklace made by the silversmith that we met in Hajirain, and we already saw that. It's an amulet asking for protection. These are the women that you see up and down that valley. They have hats. They look like witches' hats with black tops. They're all young women out tending to the primarily goats, sometimes sheep. Now we have moved to Sheba on the southern coast, which was an important silver-making area. Several families of silversmiths worked here traditionally. And I chose pieces from the Al-Amari family, the largest family there. And here is a Bedouin from the Mishkas area down there on the southern coast. She's in a bridal shop. Those are brides' dresses in the background, so maybe she's shopping for her trousseau, who knows. There is the gate into the silver market in Sheba, and these are two pieces the bride had to have. They were always worn together. These are silver loops, and these are called wushah beads, those flat beads, and then dis, which Andrea Farsach is wearing. She has dis beads on her wonderful necklace. These bracelets are done in a wheat design. They're gilded and then rubbed with a mixture of turmeric and tree resin to get that bright orange color. They also used it on some dresses. They would rub it onto the embroidery to get a colorful effect. Now these are earrings, and a woman could wear as many as 11 in each ear. And one Bedouin woman bent over and had me count the holes in her ears. She had 9 in each ear. Now we are in Mahra, which is the governorate that borders Oman. There is the most extraordinary nose ring I ever saw. It's gilded silver, and they used a special method of gilding in Mahra. It was powdered gold mixed with mercury. It was a very dangerous procedure, but it was the strongest and thickest gilding I ever saw. Because Mahra is next to Oman, they share styles. This necklace is very similar to something you would get from the western Oman. And these are 2 more pieces worn by the bride down one side of the head to indicate marriage. Now we move to Sheba, where you had that rather isolated colony of Jewish silversmiths. This necklace was worn all throughout the Hadramaut. It was very popular. Here is a mesh belt. The buckle is from Sheba, as is this buckle with those red stones. Now in Atik, which is the capital of Sheba, they had a distinct style of jewelry made out of aluminum, copper, and brass. Similar bracelets were worn in Africa, so the style traveled, obviously. Now I want to conclude my talk by showing you the pieces where I have direct evidence of women's involvement in this wonderful handicraft. It took me years to ask the right questions to find out that women were important in this. They wove that belt. Here you see the piece that the woman wove. Her husband made these pieces and added them to the belt later. But this was her handicraft, and it was called cold work because she didn't solder. Now this piece was made by a silversmith in Sana'a. He was one of the first to work after the Jewish silversmiths left. He would make the cylinder, and he would make the granules. They're flattened for this piece. And then he would leave it with his wife, and he would go off to his shop and sell and do whatever he would do there. And she would put together the design. So truly, she was the artist. Then we were up in the mountains of Mahuit, visiting a place that specialized in making items for tourists. They worked in nickel or low silver, low cost. And we went from shop to shop to shop, and all the men told us about all their work. They were quite full of themselves. And we were going by down the stairs, and there was a place where heavy curtains, heavy draperies hung, and suddenly the hand came out through the draperies, beckoning us in. Oh, come have tea. It was the ladies. And we hadn't been inside for 5 minutes. Then a young woman came out and showed us her handicraft. And she said she did the soldering. She did the hot work. And you can see her pieces here on the scabbard of this dagger case that was going to be sold eventually in Sana. Finally, this is from the Hadramaut from Sah, another deep valley. They are famous for this kind of belt. It's heavy loop and loop, and it would be wound around the waist to hold up. Their skirt was long in the back, and they needed a belt to hold it up. And a man would buy a belt. Well, the length would be determined on how wealthy he was. If he was really wealthy, he would buy a belt that would go around her waist 7 times. Imagine having to walk around with that. Well, I was going through pictures that I took at a cultural week at a high school nearby, and I found this painting of a woman weaving this belt. There are many more stories and pictures to enjoy in my book. Thank you so much.